Hello and welcome to this Facebook Live from the 106th International Labour Conference in Geneva. My name is Rosalind Yarde and today we're talking about an issue that concerns us all, the future of work. With me are Lawrence Jeff Johnson, Deputy Director of the ILO's Research Department, and Rani, ILO's Senior Economist. We'll be talking about the changes that are facing the world of work and we want you to be part of the conversation. Post your questions in the Facebook comments section and I'll put them to our experts. And don't forget to let us know where you're joining us from. Jeff, firstly, the world of work appears to be changing rapidly these days. Can you give us an overview of the major changes that we're seeing?
Well, thank you. Yes, the perception we have is the speed of innovation and technology are increasing at an increasing rate. And what we're actually seeing is when we look at inventions, we're seeing that the shelf life of many of these changes very quickly. All we have to do is look at iPhones or our Sonys, etc. But when we look at the world of work, what we're seeing is business processes change. We're seeing globalization. We're seeing supply chains come into effect. We're also seeing the introduction of robotics and artificial intelligence. So the nature of work is changing and it's affecting everyone throughout the world.
Okay, you've mentioned robots and technology. Let's talk a bit more about that.
I think you mentioned robots, I did, but okay.
Are these advances threatening jobs or will they create jobs?
Well, if we look at the last three industrial revolutions, we saw the introduction of technology in each case. And yes, it destroyed some jobs, but it had the tendency also to create jobs. What we see potentially different in this phase, this fourth industrial revolution, is are we seeing that robots, artificial intelligence, replacing human labor? And that's the question. But we actually see opportunities here because we're going to have to create these robots, these algorithms to create new forms of work, and that will require human intervention. The answer is still out. Will we continue to see job creation or will we see a true paradigm shift where we see different types of work going forward? I think Uma will look at the issue of hours of work. What will happen? So there's a lot of questions that we need to answer, and research is very important to help us understand how we see the future in order to build the future we want.
Okay, so Uma, with such advances going on and also at such speed, what would be the impact on developing economies?
Thanks, Rosalind. That's a very interesting question, actually. I think when we are talking about developing economies, it is very important to distinguish between what could be automated and what will be automated, because there's a huge gap there in the developing economies with regard to it, because to a very large extent it depends upon the capital labor ratio. Now, if labor is going to be cheap and labor costs is not going to increase so fast, then the pace of adoption is going to be slower. And this is something you see it in sectors which are quite heavily technologically advanced, say in the automobile sector, where in the developing economies not everything is automated or robotized, as they say. And what you see is the number of robotics have come in, but the pace at which they have come in is far slower than what you see in the advanced economies. Now, a thing that is quite worrying or something that we have to take care for the developing economies is this whole discussion around the reshoring. And I think I'd like to say that this is not something like a strong trend that you see, but there's a trend towards reshoring in apparel industry or in leather industry, like Adidas has moved in. Now, this could have a huge impact on the labor force of the developing countries, which have to be a very large extent dependent on these kinds of sectors to be engaging in the global labor markets. So I think the question there is, if this reshoring happens and if the trend continues, the issue is if there's no domestic demand within those economies, how are we trying to ensure that the workers have the jobs, or if they need to be moved into other activities, how do you actually train them and reskill them? I think that's one of the issues that needs to be kept in mind while we talk about this entire technological change.
Yeah. Thank you, Uma. And just to remind you, this is Facebook Live from the 106th International Labour Conference in Geneva. We do want your questions, so please keep them coming and we'll put them to our experts. Okay, Uma, just to follow on what you were just saying, we hear that while some jobs will go, others will be created. But will those who lose their jobs have the skills to take up new opportunities?
Yeah. I think here it is again very important for one to acknowledge the fact that not all the tasks or all the jobs are going to be automated. There are a number of tasks that cannot be automated because of the complexity of the task itself and because of the cognitive skills that are required. So, that would generate a whole new range of jobs that could enter the labor market. And I think the jobs that will be automated, I think there we have to be a bit more proactive, in the sense that whether it's the schools, it's the training institutions, whether it is vocational training or the universities, they have to actually keep up with the pace at which the development is happening, and to see that what are the new skills that are needed and where do we try to train them. And here it is not only hard skills, but also soft skills that are very important. That's an issue that we need to actually put in place, and this is something that has been done in the past industrial revolutions in Eastern Asian countries and also some of the South Asian countries. So that's not something new, but I think we have to bear in mind and remind ourselves and to keep pace with it. And I think the other issue that often comes up with this issue of skills and retraining and job losses has been for workers in the age group 40 to 50 years. What do you do with it? These are workers, can they be retrained or upskilled? And I think there you could come up with special incentives to retrain them, but it could also be that social protection plays a much more important role in helping these workers to invest in the kind of training that they require and they can re-enter the labor market. So it's not one mechanism, but it could be multiple mechanisms that can be put in place.
Thanks, Uma. And Jeff, how will technology affect the quality of employment?
Well, with the introduction of new innovations and technology, we're seeing a lot of the risk around certain jobs overtaken so that workers can perform their jobs in a safer manner. So the quality of jobs, again, if you think of it another way, we started out with somebody that might have been a machine tender, basic education to maintain a machine in the 70s or 80s. But now we're seeing that these jobs are more like technicians, so they require more skills, more education, so the quality of the work would move up. As Uma mentioned, the cognitive skills are becoming much more important. The point is that the quality of work, we have that opportunity, but how are we going to move it forward? And as Uma mentioned, it's often driven by also the cost of labor. If cost of labor is low and automation's high, you're not going to see those movements. But we're starting to see them throughout the world. And so it creates a lot of opportunities to improve the quality of one's work and as well as their livelihoods and their general well-being. But we have to make sure that as we move forward, we also create the number of jobs we need. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we also see an issue. As we go through this paradigm shift, are we going to see the world of the work as the same now, or is it going to change dramatically? But generally speaking, we hope the quality will move up. The share in the gains through productivity will be distributed between labor and capital. That will create more opportunities for everyone.
Right. And we've got our first question from George, and he asks us, how can you retrain people who are doing jobs that are going to be replaced by automation? How can you encourage them to move to different jobs, or how can you retrain them in different jobs which may require even more training?
Well, on that note, we've been through this before. I look back in the 80s and 90s. I used to work with the U.S. government when we looked at how we saw jobs in the Midwest leaving in manufacturing. And there you looked at opportunities. Could you train, as Uma mentioned, these 40 and 50-year-olds who have been doing a job for 20, 30 years, and they're quite skilled at doing those jobs. Can we retrain them? Some, yes, can be retrained into other occupations within that industry or even move industries. But we also have to ensure that the social protections come into play. We need to say that some people may not be able to achieve that. So how do we create an environment that they don't totally lose their way of life, that people can survive and also thrive? So it's two sides of the coin.
Right, okay. And just to remind you, you're watching Facebook Live from the 106th International Labour Conference in Geneva. Please keep your questions coming. Now, Uma, we hear a lot about the gig economy. Can you explain exactly what that is and the impact that it's having?
Okay. I think to answer your question first, gig. Now, gig applies to people who use online intermediaries to actually generate any kinds of business or services. And here I can provide you a couple of examples. It could be Airbnb or a freelance photographer or a driver using Uber, or today you have a lot of companies who have actually developed platforms and who move a number of the tasks onto the online platforms, like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, Micro Workers, Click Workers. Then there is Crowdflower or Prolific Academic. Even the academic community today has an online platform where a lot of academic tasks are actually moved in there for the workers to perform. So that anything that uses an online intermediary is actually a gig, because gig is something where people move from one task to the other. So that's where the term gig economy comes from. Now, to the question of, what has been the impact of it? Actually, interestingly, at the ILO, colleagues of ours, Janine and Valerio, they did an interesting survey way back in 2015 to look at workers on the Amazon Mechanical Turk and Crowdflower, and subsequently this year we did in another 5 platforms. What was quite interesting for us to observe from the survey was that about 40% of the respondents had their main source of income actually coming from this kind of crowd work. But at the same time, I think I'd like to remind that about 20% of the respondents who were largely dependent on crowd work couldn't meet their basic needs. So, that's the kind of issue that comes up when you're talking about crowd work, saying, what's this kind of work? Is it a regular work? No, it is not. It is a labor market with short-term work, intermittent work, and it is a work that is not of a permanent nature. And often much of this work is actually underpaid, and you do not have any of the benefits, both labor and social protection, that workers elsewhere get. So, in that sense, it is quite precarious, this kind of work.
So, I mean, the picture that you're painting is one that's quite different maybe from the workplaces that maybe us, when we're maybe slightly younger, we're used to. I mean, will the model of the workplace as we know it even exist in 50 years' time?
Yeah. Actually, yes, this is a picture that I'm painting is much more that shows that probably workers are being exploited because the work is on demand and the employers do not have to take up the responsibility of paying something when there's no work that is available. And there's also this argument that has been put about saying that all the on-demand economy work or the gig economy work is actually allowing people to do the work when they want, that is flexible hours. So one can say that, this is a very good kind of work and this is where people want to move. But in reality, this does not seem to be the case. And this is something that people have to do in the absence of other alternative opportunities that are there in the market. Now, with coming to the question of whether this model of workplace will be there in 50 years' time or not is something for us to see, because we didn't see this model that we are in today about 100 years ago. So I think that's for the time to tell whether this would continue, whether workplace would disappear or not.
Okay, that's great. So let's take another question. This one's from Oscar, and he's asking, what skills will young people need to acquire to be well equipped for the future labour market? Maybe I can put that to you, Jeff.
Well, that's a great question. I have 2 daughters that are going through university now, so I often get asked that question by them. And one advice I've given them is it's important to study still the sciences, engineering, mathematics, chemistry. But nowadays, employers are also still looking for, and people need the skills, they need to know how to learn. They need skills on how to work together within teams. And using those, the third issue is how to problem solve. Because we need individuals that can come together and solve issues. So the skills is kind of a mixed question. The thing that we often hear from employers is an issue that I can't find those people with the skills I need. And that's only one part of the statement. The other part is I can't find the people with the skills I want for the wages I'm willing to pay. And so this is where we have to look at what the marketplace is demanding. And again, when it comes to skills and occupation, they're changing very rapidly. So someone may train as an accountant, but they're going to probably end up as a financial advisor because even in that occupation, things have changed. So young people need to make sure they're able to adapt. They've learned how to learn. They learned how to work within a team, and finally how to problem solve. So have the hard skills, those are equally important, but also those soft skills, as Uma mentioned earlier, are what's going to help us move forward to resolve problems, because the world's facing a number of challenges, including climate change, and we need people that can come together and problem solve.
All right. I mean, we've talked about young people and talking about their skills, almost as if they're, that they are almost kind of commodities. But what about the artists? What about the writers, the philosophers? I mean, will the job market become so narrowly focused that they're kind of limited to areas that they don't have a passion for? Or does everything have to be geared towards a job at the end of their education?
Please. We were having a conversation over coffee this morning, and that's a great question, and we were just discussing that.
I think this to a large extent depends upon how we evolve as a society with this technological change, I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And I think I'm also reminded of what Lord Skidelsky said recently at the Global Dialogue, Future of Work We Want. The basic argument that comes up here is that, how much of leisure time do we have? And that to a very large extent depends upon what our working hours or working week is going to be. If we are going to have a shorter working hours, and if we have that shorter working hour at the same disposable income, then there's a lot of time for leisure. And then actually it allows space for all these kinds of activities, like whether, developing creative activities, being in theater, music, dance, or also to watch them. So it's a two-way process. So, if there's a demand for these kinds of activities, then you also have supply of labor that comes into place, where the youngsters would be much more, could be more creative and get into these kinds of jobs. But if we are not going to have reduction of working hours at the same disposable income as we have now, then I guess it's going to be difficult. And then the challenges for the youth to be in the labor market tomorrow becomes a big challenge.
If I can pick up on that, I know both Uma and I, when we were younger, we said we're going to grow up and be economists, just like you said you were going to be a reporter. The issue is, I think that the coming generations are going to have a lot more flexibility if we build the future we want to make those choices. So as Uma pointed out, if we can maintain or increase our disposable income, it will create opportunities for artists, musicians, but also those involved in sports and leisure. Because again, not everybody wants to be an economist. They may want to do something else. And there's where opportunities rise. So I think the world of work is going to change, and if we are able to focus that to what we want, then I think the future is wide open.
Okay, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions on automation, not surprisingly. And we have a question from Isla, and she asks, automation is nothing new. Why are we taken by surprise by these new changes in the labour market? Didn't researchers see this coming?
Well, I'll take part of that, then I'll turn it to Uma. Automation has been there since the beginning of time, since man and woman created fire. We've been innovating, and we've been moving that forward. I think what many of us feel in the last three industrial revolutions, as we have seen them, that innovation, those technologies, have led to labor productivity rise. So labor has become more productive. But what we see now, with not only with automation but with artificial intelligence, is are we going to see the artificial intelligence with the automation get to a point where it replaces labor? And whether we see that or not, that's still the question that we as researchers are looking into. And it's not going to be at the same speed throughout the world, but it will affect everyone in one way or another throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could answer it a bit, not so technically, but try to address it, let me try to see. The reason why we've got a bit more worried this time is probably because of some of the studies that have come out which try to show that, as a result of technological change or automation, there's going to be a lot of destruction of jobs, and many of the workers will not find any jobs. Now, subsequently, there have been a number of studies that have come which try to show that the extent of destruction of jobs is not to the same extent as before, as was envisaged in the earlier papers. And this to a large extent depends upon the kind of methodologies that one has been using. So I think one has to be a bit more balanced with regard to trying to say, to what extent this automation would lead to loss of jobs. And to this extent, there's also an interesting piece written by Lawrence Michel and a colleague who tries to show that actually, based on all the studies that have come out, there's actually no job loss or no increase in inequality as a result of automation. So I think one needs to have still a balanced view about the extent of destruction that it might have. Probably this revolution, like the others, might also create a number of other jobs. So probably one would have to watch and see what happens.
Right. But we have talked about precarious work in relation to the gig economy. And here we have a question from Nicholas. And he says, how will increasingly insecure work and increasingly expensive higher education impact the future labour market? And is there a place for employers to fill that gap and promote training and development? Sorry, this is a three-part question. And can governments provide incentives to drive this?
Well, I think we had to try to divide this question.
We'll try to divide this one up because I think Nicholas is throwing out a lot of issues there. He's right. I mean, when we look at this new wave of automation, etc., it will create jobs. The question is what skills are going to be needed, and it will continue to evolve. And the way it sounds, Nicholas must be coming from the United States because he's talking about the high price of education, which keeps rising, I'm assuming. But here's where we see, again, it's the issue of how do governments, workers, and employers come together. And if we look back into the 70s and 80s, we saw a lot of joint initiatives to improve training, vocational training, skills development, and also in sharing the cost and the burden of higher educations. However, we still see certain countries around the world, including Germany and others, that invest very heavily in vocational training and skills development. So having the social partners come together to address these concerns is paramount. And that's one of the things that often gets discussed here at the International Labor Conference. How do these three parties work together? So I'm sure I didn't answer everything he had because it was a very complex question.
But I think the issue of higher price of education, that is something where I think the governments would have to intervene and try to see how they could subsidize higher education or get the right skills to the workers. And there could be also other mechanisms like the employers trying to have subsidized schemes of retraining and upskilling their workers. So this is something that the tripartite could actually work together to see that the issues, the concerns of the workers are actually addressed.
Okay, let's move to a slightly different area about gender. Now, how are women likely to be affected by this changing world of work? We already know that in the world of work as we know it at the moment, there are inequalities. There is a gender pay gap. But in the future, are women going to be even more affected by these changes?
I think so. In a sense, we have seen across the world that the labor force participation rates for women have not been rising. They've been on a decline. The gender gaps have been narrowing in some parts of the world, but the narrowing is probably not a good story because part of it has to do with the exit of men from the labor market. So these are concerns that we already have. Now, what the future would bring about is something can be quite drastic because if you talk about the developing countries, you could see that because of this reshoring, if it ever happens, you have a huge segment of the industries like the apparel and electronic industries where women are engaged in big numbers. So, if these industries are going to move to the advanced world, and if there's no demand for these products there, women are going to be exiting out of the labor market. It's going to be very difficult to reskill, train them, and to find other activities where they can go in. So that's one huge concern that we have. But at the same time, let me tell you that it can be that automation triggers off a number of other jobs that where women can enter. Like it could be in research and development, it could be for teaching, coaching, trainers, or the care economy. As you see that the proportion of old age is increasing, and that's in Care is a sector where women are engaged in huge numbers. So it is a possibility that women might find opportunities, but it's a larger question whether the opportunities would have a good quality employment or not. And that's something we'll have to address as it comes.
Well, again, we've seen in some cases, before returning to Geneva 2 years ago as Deputy Director in Research, I was the country director in the Philippines. And we saw that with innovation and technology, it created new sectors. We had a lot of business processing centers in the Philippines that were often staffed by young, well-educated women with degrees in accounting, etc. So it has created opportunities, but I think Uma's pointed out correctly that the risk of reshoring is not going to just affect those individuals in manufacturing of low cost, but it also could impact those people engaged in higher development sectors, such as these business processing centers. But what we need to ensure is that we don't target any one gender into any one occupation. We want to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to engage, but the challenges are going to be there. How do we ensure that we have women and men engaging in the sciences? And like we said, if the arts become more popular, to engage within the arts and leisure. So we want to make sure that through that gender lens, we make sure everyone has an equal opportunity.
All right. Let's turn this more now to the ILO and the ILO's response to all of these changes. Recently, I know that there was a global symposium was held here to discuss many of the issues that we've been discussing this afternoon. What are the kind of key lessons or key takeaways from that will inform the ILO as it moves towards its centenary?
Well, I think I'll start on that one. The event was somewhat unique. We had 700 people attending the event. We had several thousand following online. And I think the takeaways that I saw was the future of work is going to be different for different people throughout the world. Just as many lessons can be learned from the South as from the North. But it's a question of how we move together. And I think the DG said one line that I liked very much. When we look at the future of work, at least in recent days, people often think about innovation and just technology, but that's only one of the factors. We're dealing with migration, we're dealing with demographics, we're dealing with climate change. There are many factors that are going to impact the future of work. So what we need to ensure, according to DG, and I love this statement, we need to ensure the future of work works in Silicon Valley and the Nile Valley. We need to make sure we're dealing with this in a way that we're addressing everyone's future of work, so we're inclusive. And it will take all of us to working together to ensure the future we want.
Right. And Uma?
I think one of the biggest takeaways that I thought came out was the fact that the importance of social dialogue. And we at the ILO are really at the center of this, and that's very important if we want to discuss about the future of work. And I think that, for me, was the biggest takeaway.
Yeah. Okay, can we just take another question? It may well be our last one as we begin to wind up. This is from Frederick, and he asks, is it time for new binding international labour standards to tackle these challenges?
Well, thanks. It's an interesting question, and this was something that had been discussed, and Lord Skidelsky and I were having a discussion before we had the event, and the term that was often used, do we need a hardening of international organizations and binding resolutions? And we're not quite sure what it's going to be, but I think Uma hit the nail on the head last was what it comes right back to is social dialogue. We need to ensure that workers, employers, or governments are coming together at the global level to ensure decent work. But that doesn't mean that we cannot produce better instruments to help them achieve that. But at the cornerstone of the future of work will be that social dialogue. And what's concerning to me is we're seeing a significant decrease in union membership and union density. So social dialogue is not as strong nor as where it was nor where it should be. So I think much more needs to be done to promote that. And if you talk to many of the employers, they'll actually tell you having a union, an active union, helps them also improve productivity. So I think, again, when you really look past the paranoia, social dialogue has to be at the forefront of us building a successful future.
Thanks, Jeff. The time has gone amazingly quickly, and I'm afraid it's time to close. And we've been listening to Facebook Live at the 106th International Labour Conference in Geneva, and we've been speaking to Lawrence Jeff Johnson, Deputy Director of the ILO Research Department, and ILO Senior Economist, Uma Rani. And I hope you've enjoyed this Facebook Live, and join us for the next one. Goodbye.